It was just an ordinary morning at the airport, until one man's arrogance collided with a truth he never saw coming. A black woman in a charcoal blazer stood quietly at gate 27, gazing out at a departing aircraft. Calm, composed. Just another traveler, or so it seemed. But within minutes, an arrogant pilot swaggered up, assuming she was just another curious bystander. He lectured her on aviation, talked about lift, thrust, and the pressure of command in the cockpit, never realizing he was preaching to the woman who'd just been appointed as his new boss. What happened next flipped the script entirely. Because the very next day, that same pilot found himself in a mandatory leadership workshop, led by her. And that was only the beginning. What unfolded from that encounter would shake an entire airline, uproot a toxic hierarchy, and prove once again that you never know who you're talking down to. Stay with me. This is a story about power, humility, and second chances. Before we dive in, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of justice, transformation, and truth. Let's begin. There are places in America where time seems to fold in on itself. The airport, with all its gates and sterile light, is one such place, a modern cathedral to movement, to ambition, to exile. And on this morning, in the belly of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International, a certain ritual was unfolding as it always does. Planes came and went like distant promises. Announcements floated over the intercom like sermons. And men, white men mostly, walked the terminals with the kind of confidence one acquires when the world has never told them no. Captain Darius Cole was one of them. Tall, clean-cut, with the cocky poise of a man who had never been truly humbled, Darius wore his Delta Airlines pilot uniform like it was a crown. His shoes were shined to a mirror gloss, his jawline rigid with entitlement. For stripes on his shoulder said he had climbed, but he'd never once looked down to see whose backs he stood on. He strode past Gate A-17 like it belonged to him, his presence cutting through the crowd like a knife through silk. He had just wrapped a red-eye from Dallas, and though fatigue tugged at the corners of his eyes, ego buoyed him. He needed a coffee, a compliment, and maybe a quiet corner to hold court about his last flight's turbulence, which, in his telling, always bordered on the miraculous. That's when he saw her. A woman stood by the window, staring at a Boeing 767 as it taxied across the tarmac. She wore a charcoal blazer and low heels, her natural curls gathered into a bun, her posture still as sculpture. She wasn't scrolling her phone. She wasn't fumbling with a boarding pass. She simply watched the jet with a focus that unnerved Darius. She didn't look lost. She looked like she belonged. And that was the problem. Because she was black. Not loud, not flashy, no, that would have been easier. She was composed. Impossibly composed. And for Darius, whose authority had long gone unchallenged, a black woman with that kind of serenity could only be a curiosity or a threat. "Beautiful machine, huh?" he said, approaching with a crooked smile. She turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable. "Yes," she said. "Majestic, really. The way it lifts all that weight like it's nothing." Darius chuckled. Most people don't understand how complex these things really are. All that lift and thrust, there's real science behind it. I've been flying for over a decade. Trust me, it's not just about pressing autopilot. She offered a half smile. I imagine it takes a lot of discipline. He nodded, swelling. Discipline, intuition, nerves of steel. Up there in the cockpit, you're not just a pilot. You're a decision-maker, a leader. People's lives are in your hands. And yet, she didn't flinch. Didn't widen her eyes or flatter him like so many others did. Instead, she glanced at her watch and said, "Well, thank you for the lecture, Captain." Cole, he filled in, almost disappointed that she hadn't asked. "Captain Darius Cole." She nodded. "Captain Cole. I'm sure we'll see each other again." And then, like a whisper, she was gone. Walking off toward another gate, her heels clicking in rhythm with the quiet authority she carried. Darius stood there for a moment, feeling oddly unsettled. He didn't know her name, didn't know what airline she worked for. Hell, he didn't even know if she worked for one at all. But something about her calm had rattled him. Because she hadn't looked up to him. She had looked right at him. And that, for a man like Darius, was more dangerous than turbulence at 30,000 feet. The story, of course, was just beginning. But already the fault lines had formed. Not just between one man and one woman, but between an entire system and the quiet, relentless people who refused to be erased by it. Stay tuned. Because the next time they met, she wouldn't be standing by a window. She'd be standing at the front of the room with the power to rewrite everything he thought he knew. There are rooms in this country where truth doesn't knock, it waits in the shadows, listening. One such room was Delta's pilot training facility, tucked behind the glamour of Atlanta's main terminal, windowless and lit with fluorescent ambition. It was here that Captain Darius Cole found himself the very next morning, sipping lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup and swapping small talk with men who looked like him, thought like him, and rarely questioned what they couldn't see. They spoke in acronyms and altitude, chuckled about rookie mistakes, and rolled their eyes at policy updates with the weary arrogance of men who believed experience was a shield against accountability. For years, Darius had worn that same shield. And yet today, it felt thinner than usual. His mind kept circling back to the woman at Gate A-17, the one with the stillness in her eyes and the dignity in her silence. He didn't know why she lingered in his thoughts. Maybe it was the way she didn't defer to him. Or maybe, deeper still, it was because her presence had quietly reminded him that being a man of rank didn't mean you were right. But that line of thinking was dangerous. In his world, self-doubt could get you grounded. The announcement came over the intercom like a curtain being drawn. All captains and senior flight crew, please report to Briefing Room C for today's leadership orientation. Mandatory attendance. Darius fell in line, striding into the room with the same gait he always carried, shoulders squared, chin lifted, the portrait of competence. The room was packed. Rows of chairs, projection screens, and murmurs about new safety metrics and procedural enforcement. Then the door opened and the woman from the terminal walked in. Only this time, she wasn't a bystander. She was the keynote. She stood at the front, in a slate gray suit and a badge that shimmered under the lights. Ava Richardson, Director of Flight Operations and Training Initiatives. The same woman he had patronized less than 24 hours ago. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm, confident, and measured like a well-balanced aircraft. "I'm here to speak with you about the future of cockpit leadership, not just in terms of safety protocols, but in culture, what we tolerate, what we ignore, and what we allow to define us." Darius shifted in his seat. He wasn't alone. Some pilots crossed their arms. Others leaned back with a smirk, their expressions saying what their mouths wouldn't. Another diversity hire with a microphone. No one said it aloud. They didn't have to. The room was full of subtleties, the kind that weren't in any handbook, but were lived, breathed, and deeply felt by those on the margins. Ava continued, gliding through data, safety statistics, testimonials from crew members, some praising mentorship, others quietly pointing to moments of disrespect in the cockpit. She didn't name names. She didn't raise her voice, but her words pressed against the walls like heat. In the air, she said, there is no room for ego. No space for silent hierarchies to decide whose voice matters. When a co-pilot hesitates to speak because of how they're seen, not by their rank, but by their race, their gender, their accent, that is not a cultural difference. That is a safety risk. Some in the room looked away. One man scoffed. Another tapped his phone under the desk, disengaging. But Darius? He was locked in. Because he remembered, too clearly, the smugness in his tone when he explained thrust and lift to her. The way he assumed she was a novice. The way she let him. And now, she had the floor. When the session ended, Ava opened the floor for questions. Silence stretched like a runway. No one dared speak first. And then, slowly, deliberately, Darius stood up. "Captain Cole," she said, acknowledging him without warmth or contempt. "Just a fact." He cleared his throat. "I had an experience recently. I think it's relevant." The room turned to him. His voice, usually steady, faltered under the weight of honesty. "I assumed someone didn't know what they were talking about because they weren't in uniform. I thought I was helping, but I wasn't. I was condescending. And I realize now that moment wasn't about aviation. It was about me. My need to feel above someone." Ava watched him. The silence in the room deepened, heavy as gravity. "That kind of thinking," Darius continued, "doesn't belong in a cockpit. Or anywhere." There was no applause. No attaboys. Just the stillness of recognition. The slow turning of a page. Ava nodded once. "Acknowledgement is a start. Let's build from there." And just like that, the gate had shifted. Not a revolution, no. But a reckoning. Because the real turbulence wasn't in the air, it was in the quiet spaces between people. In the assumptions. In the way certain men entered rooms believing they owned them. And in the way certain women, particularly Black women, had learned to master the art of letting fools expose themselves. What Darius Cole began to learn that day was not about leadership manuals or checklists. It was about humility, about listening, and above all, about the dangerous illusions of power and who really holds it. You can tell a great deal about a country by how its workers speak when the boss leaves the room. And in the break room of Delta's flight operations building, truth lingered in the pauses between laughter, in the bitterness beneath the jokes. Coffee brewed endlessly, but real warmth was rare. It was a place meant for rest, but restlessness always found its way in. Captain Darius Cole sat at the small round table near the window, tapping a spoon against a porcelain cup with more rhythm than patience. A few feet away, 3 other captains, white men of similar age and tenure, leaned over their conversation like gamblers around a quiet fire. "That new director," one of them muttered, shaking his head. "You hear she wants to revise the entire flight deck culture manual?" Darius didn't look up. But he listened. "Yeah," another replied, biting into a donut. "It's always culture this and inclusion that. Next thing you know, we'll have to ask the flight attendants for permission to take off." They laughed. The sound was not loud, but it stung because Darius had laughed like that before. Years ago. Before he realized that what passed for camaraderie in some circles was often just fear, dressed in sarcasm. "She's sharp," the first one conceded, reluctantly. "But something about her. I don't know. There's a line. You step on it wrong, and suddenly you're being called out for unconscious bias." Darius finally spoke. "Maybe that's because the line's been stepped on for decades. And now someone's finally drawing it bold enough for folks to see." The laughter stopped. The air changed, like a storm had entered the room in a suit. One of them looked over, eyes narrowing slightly, not in hostility, but in calculation. "Come on, Darius. You've flown with us for years. You know how this works. You don't really think we've got a discrimination problem, do you? And that's the thing about discrimination, it never looks like a problem to the ones handing out the discomfort." Darius didn't respond right away. He sipped his coffee, letting the silence stretch like a tarmac. Then he leaned forward. "I've flown with co-pilots too nervous to correct a senior captain's mistake. Not because they didn't know the right procedure, but because they had an accent. Or braids. Or they wore a hijab. I've watched flight attendants with darker skin get dismissed as difficult, while others with the same tone got called assertive. So yeah, I think we have a problem. We just call it professionalism to hide it." No one spoke. One of the captains looked away, suddenly fascinated by a spot on the floor. Darius stood up. He wasn't angry. Not anymore. Just tired. Tired of rooms where men protected their comfort at the cost of others' dignity. Tired of pretending the skies were neutral when the runway was sloped from the start. He stepped to the window. Outside, a young woman in a crisp Delta blazer was helping an elderly man navigate the escalator. Small gesture, but powerful. He wondered what kind of break room awaited her. The door opened. Aisha Richardson stepped in, scanning the room. She nodded at the group, then met Darius's eyes. "Captain Cole," she said, calm as a cruise altitude. "You're scheduled to observe a cross-crew collaboration simulation in Hangar 4 at 1300. He nodded. "I'll be there." She turned to leave, but paused. Glanced at the other captains. "By the way," she added, "for those of you interested, we're reviewing informal feedback on cockpit dynamics this week. I'd encourage you to participate. That is, if you're not too comfortable to grow." And, just like that, she left. Darius returned to his seat. No one looked at each other. The coffee machine hissed, loud in the silence. Because nothing is louder than a truth no one wants to hear. Every institution claims to value the truth until the truth asks for a seat at the table. And inside Hangar 4, truth came dressed in silence and carried the weight of history like a second uniform. It was there, tucked beneath the emergency checklists and mock control panels, embedded in the fluorescent buzz of the training center where Delta's most senior pilots gathered for a simulation on collaboration under crisis. But what they were really testing wasn't teamwork. It was tolerance. It was hierarchy. It was how deeply the human mind resists being questioned by the very people it has been taught, sometimes unconsciously, not to hear. Captain Darius Cole stood near the rear of the training cockpit, clipboard in hand. He wasn't flying this time. He was observing, as assigned. But he'd flown through enough real storms to know when one was brewing beneath the surface. In the captain's seat sat Lionel Morgan, a pilot as seasoned as he was prideful. 32 years in the sky, 3 decades of doing it the right way, as he liked to say. And next to him, in the first officer's seat, sat Tamika Reyes, a young, brilliant Afro-Latina woman who had flown military jets before switching to commercial aviation. She was methodical, sharp, but she'd learned early to couch confidence in politeness. The simulation involved a pressurization failure at 30,000 feet. The clock ticked. Oxygen masks deployed. Warning lights flashed. And the air got thinner, not just in the scenario, but in the room. Tamika tried to speak. "Captain, the secondary valve isn't responding. I recommend switching to the backup system and initiating a descent to 10,000. But Morgan cut her off, his voice booming. "We're not descending yet. That's premature. Let the system autocorrect. You stick to your panel." Darius didn't flinch, but he marked it down. Tamika hesitated, just long enough for the simulator to introduce a new failure. Cabin pressure dropped rapidly. The screen flashed a bright red override warning. She leaned forward again, firmer this time. "Sir, we're losing pressurization at a critical rate. Protocol says immediate descent." Morgan huffed. "I've flown through worse than this. Trust me." And there it was, the trust that never caught you if you weren't the one who looked like authority. Behind the glass, in the observation deck, Aisha Richardson watched without expression. But her silence was not emptiness. It was a calculation. It was a woman watching a story she knew too well to play out once again, this time with modern software and a flight vest. Outside the simulator, the instructor ended the exercise. "Captain Morgan, your call delayed the simulated descent by 2 full minutes," he said evenly. In a real-world event, that might have led to passenger injuries or worse. Morgan grunted, brushing off the remark. "These simulations exaggerate risk. In the real world, instinct matters more than theory." Darius stepped forward. "Instinct isn't the same as experience. And experience doesn't give you the right to ignore protocol or your first officer." The room stilled. Tamika sat, composed but visibly shaken. Not by the simulation. By the knowledge that if she hadn't insisted, even just hypothetically, people might have been hurt. One of the senior observers leaned in toward Aisha. "Do you think this is a leadership problem?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "I think it's a listening problem." That night, in the pilot lounge, the murmurs began. "They're trying to make us second-guess our instincts. They want to change what made us great. They're making it about race." No one said Tamika's name. But Darius heard the message. And for every pilot who stayed silent, who whispered agreement in the safety of distance, there were two others who said nothing at all, because they feared what speaking might cost. The real emergency wasn't in the simulator. It was in the silence that followed. Because when arrogance flies the plane and bias clips the wings, the descent is never simulated. It's real. And it's coming. In every institution, beneath the polished marble of official policy and professional courtesy, there exists another structure, one built not of laws but of looks, of nods, of shared silences. A whisper network, they call it. And in the aviation world, those whispers carried further than any jet engine. After the simulation, word spread not through email or meetings, but through body language. A cocked eyebrow in the pilot lounge, a cleared throat at the coffee pot, a too casual mention of that aggressive young co-pilot who tried to override a seasoned veteran. Tamika Reyes had followed the rules. She had done everything the manuals and morality had instructed. But those who wanted to ignore her still found a way to recast her as the problem. Because power, when threatened, does not retreat. It rewrites. And yet something began to stir. It started with the youngest first officers, pilots just a few years out of training, men and women of all shades, some with thick Southern accents, others with Brooklyn slang, some immigrants whose dreams were painted in contrails across an adopted sky. They'd watched what happened in the simulator room, and they felt it. Not just the breach of procedure, but the breach of dignity. One afternoon, Darius Cole sat alone in the break room when a young pilot named Evan Chung approached. Evan, barely 30, flew with precision and kept mostly to himself. "Captain," he said, voice low, "I saw what happened with Reyes. I've seen it before too. Not as loud, but just as real. I flew with Morgan last year. He questioned my ability to communicate with ATC just because of my last name." Darius looked up slowly. "Did you report it?" A hollow laugh. "No. You think they'd believe me over him?" And there it was again, the quiet math of risk. The balancing act between truth and survival. Darius nodded slowly. "What if we don't have to do this alone?" That same week, Aisha called a confidential roundtable, no uniforms, no ranks. Just voices. She invited pilots and staff from every corner of the airline. Black, white, Latino, Asian, male, female, queer, straight. Veterans and rookies alike. The topic was official, improving cross-cockpit communication. But the subtext was sharper than any checklist. Tamika came. So did Evan. So did a Nigerian-born mechanic who'd been passed over for promotion twice despite solving a hydraulic glitch that grounded 6 flights. So did a flight attendant who once had to explain to a passenger that her afro wasn't a security concern. The stories poured out like suppressed stormwater breaking a dam. My accent makes them double-check everything I say on the intercom. They think I'm being difficult if I assert protocol. I've had captains ignore safety flags just to avoid being corrected by a woman. Aisha didn't speak for the first 40 minutes. She didn't have to. She knew that power speaks best when it first learns to listen. When she did speak, her words were precise. This isn't just about hurt feelings. This is about safety. When respect disappears from the cockpit, clarity follows it out the door. And clarity is what keeps people alive. Still, the old guard pushed back. Morgan and his allies began meeting after hours, bitter behind closed doors. They used words like tradition and legacy, but what they meant was control. One night, someone scrawled on the whiteboard in the training center, "Experience doesn't need permission." No one signed it. But everyone understood who it was for. Darius, Tamika, and a few others responded in the only way they could, by flying better. Sharper checklists. More open communications. praise from flight attendants. Whisper networks can work both ways. And in that subtle shift, those small acts of unity, a new current began to form under the surface. A countercurrent. One that carried not just a grievance, but a vision. A vision that the sky didn't belong to one kind of man anymore. That respect didn't have to be earned through swagger, but through mutual responsibility. That silence was no longer safe. It was complicity. By the end of the week, Morgan confronted Darius in the corridor near the simulator bay. His voice was low, but his tone was venomous. "You're dividing this crew," he said. "You and your pet projects." Darius didn't flinch. "No, Lionel. You divided it when you made respect conditional." Morgan shook his head. "You think management's gonna side with you?" "With her." A sharp jab of his chin toward Aisha's office. Darius's eyes narrowed. "They won't have to. Because soon, the passengers will know. And they won't care about your stripes. They'll care about who keeps them safe." That was the turning point. Because even in the sky, the ground starts to shift. There comes a time in every man's life when he is made to answer for the comfort he mistook for justice. And for some, that time arrives not with a trial, but with a quiet memo and the eyes of a watchful world. Delta's quarterly safety audit was scheduled for mid-October, a procedural formality in the eyes of most captains, something to be endured with mild irritation and polite nods. But this year, it came like a reckoning wrapped in corporate stationery. Because this year, for the first time, they were auditing culture. Behind closed doors, a task force had been quietly assembled, diverse in background, but aligned in mission. It included Aisha. It included Darius. And it included voices who had for too long whispered their warnings into indifferent air. Meanwhile, Captain Morgan's shadow loomed like an oil slick on a runway, thick, slow-moving, and ready to ignite with a spark. In one particularly charged moment, a flight attendant named Carla Henderson filed a formal report. She described how Captain Morgan ignored a safety concern she raised mid-flight, a leaking lavatory pipe that had created a slippery hazard. When she spoke up, he waved her off with a smirk. "Worry about the coffee, sweetheart. Leave the flying to men with wings." She'd taken it to HR. But she'd also taken it to Aisha. And that changed everything. Because this time, HR didn't file it under interpersonal misunderstanding. This time, it became Exhibit A. The older captains, men who once clapped shoulders and told stories of rough landings as proof of manhood, grew quiet. Not out of guilt, but out of fear. Fear that their reign of unchecked command was entering its final descent. Some lashed out. One pilot anonymously leaked internal emails to a fringe blog, accusing Delta of reverse discrimination and emasculating its leadership. The post included a cartoon of a flight deck with a female captain crashing a plane into a stack of HR policies. The cartoon circulated for hours before Aisha found out. She didn't respond with outrage. No press conference. No tears. Instead, she called a meeting with legal, compliance, and the board. 2 days later, the pilot responsible was grounded indefinitely. And not even Morgan could protect him. But power doesn't vanish, it mutates. Morgan pivoted. He began holding informal breakfasts with executives, dressing his agenda in buzzwords: legacy expertise, pilot autonomy, operational simplicity. He was trying to keep one foot in the past and the other in the future, but the runway had changed beneath him. What Morgan didn't understand, what men like him never understand, is that the future isn't something you negotiate with. You either prepare for it, or it leaves you behind. And the clock was ticking. On a windy Friday morning, a small but symbolic exercise was conducted in one of Delta's most advanced simulators. 2 crews, one led by Darius, the other by Morgan, were given identical emergency scenarios: a sudden cabin depressurization at 30,000 feet. The difference? One team used the new communication protocols Aisha had implemented. The other flew old school. Darius's crew coordinated across roles, handled passenger instructions, stabilized the cabin pressure, and made an emergency landing in record time. Morgan's crew? They delayed action, arguing about who should give the command. His co-pilot was hesitant to speak up, having been shut down so many times before. In the debrief room, the data didn't lie. The simulation was recorded. The transcripts printed. The conclusions written in black ink across a page no amount of rank could erase. Later that evening, Aisha walked past the break room. She overheard Morgan talking to a younger pilot, voice lowered but laced with venom. "You think she really knows what it's like up there? What does it mean to hold a plane steady in a thunderhead at midnight? Hell, she probably still checks manuals before she flies." The young pilot didn't respond. He just nodded. But the look in his eyes told the truth. He was done believing that strength had to be loud. By the end of that week, the task force submitted their initial recommendations. One item stood out: leadership review for all captains with documented resistance to safety communication protocols. The old world shifted. Morgan received a formal notice of internal investigation. Not for one incident, but a pattern of behavior. And for the first time, he couldn't spin it. Couldn't smirk it away. He sat alone in the crew lounge, watching younger pilots walk past him, not with fear, but with resolve. Some nodded respectfully. Others didn't acknowledge him at all. Because respect, like airspeed, must be earned again and again. Outside, a 737 roared down the tarmac, lifting into the blue. Darius watched it rise. So did Aisha. "We're not just changing policy," she said softly. "We're changing who gets to feel safe in the sky. And who gets to lead," Darius added. Aisha smiled, but there was weariness in her eyes. "Justice," she said, "isn't about one landing. It's the flight that never ends." There comes a moment in every country's reckoning when the stage is set, the actors are summoned, and the curtain rises not for a performance, but for a trial of the nation's conscience. This hearing, called to investigate a pilot's conduct, was never just about flight protocol. It was about power. It was about the weight of uniforms and the lightness of certain people's grievances when held up against the gravity of others' lived experience. It was about what we choose to excuse and whom we are too afraid to hold accountable. A hearing room had been cleared in the Delta Operations Building, not far from the runways where engines roared with purpose. But inside, the silence was deafening. Captain Lionel Morgan entered, flanked by his union representative and a legal advisor, his stride slow, shoulders still defiant, as though he believed this too would pass, as all other storms had. But this storm carried data, testimony, and witnesses. At the front sat a review board of 5, 2 airline executives, 1 FAA liaison, 1 legal compliance officer, and Aisha Harrington, seated not as an accuser, but as a leader tasked with defending the system from the erosion of its own silence. And in the gallery, among pilots, co-pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew, sat Darius, the quiet conscience of this entire ordeal. The hearing began with opening remarks, civil, restrained, procedural. Then came the evidence. A video playback of a training simulation gone wrong, with Morgan shouting down his co-pilot for speaking out of turn. An audio recording where Morgan dismissed a flight attendant's safety concern with a crude joke and a curse. Testimony from 3 junior pilots, 2 women, 1 Vietnamese American, 1 Black, who described being ignored, interrupted, or assigned meaningless duties during flight rotations because, as Morgan allegedly put it, they needed to toughen up. Morgan sat still. His lawyer objected here and there. Lack of corroboration. Taken out of context. An isolated incident. But it was the pattern that spoke. It was the silence in the room that answered. Aisha was called last. When she took the stand, the tension shifted, not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't. "I did not ask to be here today as someone seeking revenge," she began, voice calm as a landing while touching tarmac. I am here because a system that ignores its flaws cannot promise safety to its passengers, nor justice to its people. She spoke not only of protocols and safety briefings, but of the quiet cultural rot that sets in when power is inherited, not earned. When a black woman speaks up in the cockpit and is ignored, she said, when a young pilot of color is told to keep his place, it is not only disrespectful. It is dangerous. She turned slightly to look at Morgan, not in accusation, but in clarity. And when men confuse seniority with supremacy, they do not just endanger their crews. They sabotage the future of flight itself. The room was still. Even Morgan's defenders looked at the table in front of them. Because no policy could cover the shame of being called out by truth delivered with dignity. The board recessed. Outside the hearing room, the hallway filled with hushed voices. Some pilots who had once rolled their eyes at all this culture nonsense now spoke in tones of reflection. One captain muttered, "She's right. I've seen it. We've all seen it." Another nodded. "We let too much slide because he flew well." But flying well, Aisha had shown, was not enough. Not when you crush the spirit of your team to do it. An hour later, the board returned. The verdict was unanimous. Captain Morgan would be relieved of duty pending further review for permanent dismissal. Mandatory retraining on inclusion and leadership standards would be instituted fleet-wide, and a new anonymous system for crew feedback would be launched within the month. Morgan didn't speak. He looked older suddenly. Not just in face, but in spirit, as if history had finally caught up to him and was now escorting him out the door he had once locked behind others. Later that evening, as the sun dropped behind the control tower, Aisha stood on a quiet observation deck overlooking the runway. Darius joined her. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. "Do you think he learned anything?" Darius asked finally. Aisha took a breath. "Maybe," she said. But this wasn't for him to learn. It was for the others watching. He nodded, thoughtful. "I used to think progress came when the old guards stepped aside," he said. "It still might," Aisha replied. "But only if we build something stronger in the space they leave behind. Progress, if it is to mean anything at all, must be more than the moving of names on office doors or the passing of new policies dressed in corporate jargon. Real progress is felt in the marrow of ordinary people's lives, in the quiet dignity of being treated as human, in the unspoken relief of not being feared, watched, or dismissed before one ever speaks. But dignity, once denied, does not return without scars. And racism, polite, well-dressed, credentialed racism, rarely leaves quietly. Weeks passed since the hearing that brought down Captain Lionel Morgan, and the corridors of Delta's training division buzzed with reform. Memos were sent. Workshops booked. Posters adorned break rooms with slogans like "Every voice counts in the cockpit" and "Respect is our altitude." Yet beneath the fresh gloss of change, a tension lingered, like smoke after a fire had been put out. Captain Damian Bradley had begun walking taller, not out of pride, but responsibility. He understood now that leadership wasn't about command. It was about what you refused to let slide. And still, there were murmurs. Some senior pilots grumbled at the water cooler. "She's changing everything that used to work just fine. She'll be gone by next year. These things blow over." Or the more insidious, "I treat everyone the same. But not everyone is cut out for this job." They said it with smiles, with folded arms, with union pins and tenure to shield them from consequence. But Aisha Harrington heard every word, even when it wasn't spoken. One late afternoon, she called for a closed-door meeting, not with executives, but with a rotating group of junior staff, flight attendants, mechanics, gate agents, even custodians. Darius sat among them. "I want to hear the truth," Aisha said. "Tell me what hasn't changed. Tell me what still hurts." One young Latina mechanic spoke first, her voice low. "They still check my badge twice, as long when I enter the hangar. Just me, not the others." A flight attendant in his 50s nodded. "If a white captain's upset with my report, they call me emotional. If I'm calm, they call me uncooperative." Darius added softly, "They still assume I'm here to move bags, not brief pilots." I stopped correcting them. Some days I just don't have it in me. Aisha wrote it all down. Not in a report for show, but in a ledger of accountability. A map of pain the system had drawn across people's everyday lives. That same week, a new flight training module launched, one that included real-world scenarios involving racial bias in crew communication. Predictably, resistance flared. "This has nothing to do with flying," one captain barked. "No," Aisha replied calmly. "It has everything to do with landing safely together." And that's when it happened. A story broke in the press. A former pilot had leaked an internal email chain, one in which several captains mocked the reforms, calling Aisha a diversity hire with a messiah complex. The article ran with headlines meant to inflame. "Turbulence at 30,000 feet. DI push backfires at Delta." The news cycle pounced. Commentators weighed in. And once again, the spotlight turned on Aisha, not for her confidence, but for her complexion. The board held an emergency meeting. Some executives squirmed, suggesting Aisha take a brief sabbatical while things cooled down. She refused. "You do not ask a surgeon to step aside during the operation just because the blood makes you uncomfortable," she said. And then, as if summoned by fate, came a moment that would test everything she'd built. On a routine flight to Chicago, a mechanical fault triggered a mid-air emergency. A cockpit crew, trained under the new CRM model, responded perfectly. The landing was safe. Not a single life lost. What no one expected. The captain was one of the junior pilots Morgan had once ridiculed for relying too much on procedure. And the first officer? A black woman who'd nearly quit 6 months earlier after being told to smile more and speak less. Their calm, synchronized execution during the crisis made national news. CNN ran the headline, "Delta's new generation of pilots prove preparedness pays off." The New York Times quoted a passenger who said, "They didn't just land the plane. They made us feel safe. Like we mattered." By the time the board reconvened, it was no longer a question of whether Aisha's reforms would stay. It was a question of how much more they could expand. One board member, older, once skeptical, stood up and said, "We don't just need her. We need 10 more like her." In her quiet office overlooking the runway, Aisha sat with Darius at dusk. They watched the horizon burn orange, the way it does when the world is both ending and beginning again. "You think we changed anything?" Darius asked. Aisha smiled faintly. "No," she said. "I think we started something." Outside, another plane roared to life. It carried no banner, no declaration. Just people, each with a story, a struggle, a prayer in their chest. And if those people landed safe, it would be because someone once refused to stay silent. Someone once remembered that truth, when spoken with courage, can fly farther than fear.